Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of Timely Topics. Today, I'll be sitting down with Dr. Reid Waldman to talk about his journey as the founder and CEO of Veradermics. As a board-certified dermatologist with more than 10 years of clinical experience, Reid has dedicated his research to discovering and working with paradigm-shifting solutions to common dermatological conditions. Reid started his entrepreneurial journey while he was a fellow at UConn Health and participated in several of CCEI programs. I'm excited to have Reid join us here in the Collaboratory to share his story on his journey from doctor to entrepreneur. Welcome, Reid. Thank you so much for joining us here in the Collaboratory.
Jen, it is so wonderful to be here, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun today.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, so I would love for you to tell our audience a little bit more about yourself, your background, and tell us a little bit more about Veradermics.
Yeah, so I'm Reid Waldman. I'm co-founder and CEO of Veradermics. By background, I'm a board-certified dermatologist, and prior to founding Veradermics, my focus was really in clinical research. So I've about 100 publications, wrote a textbook, was an investigator for numerous phase 2 and phase 3 clinical studies, and then co-founded Veradermics in 2019. And for those of you who are not familiar with the company, Veradermics is an aesthetics and dermatology-focused biopharmaceutical company. Our lead asset, we believe, is a best-in-indication product for the $30 billion plus androgenetic alopecia pattern hair loss product. And that is an asset for which we are actively dosing in 2 pivotal trials to seek and support the approval of the product. So super exciting time for us.
So for all of us that don't have a medical or science background, do you want to tell us what Veradermics really does?
Yeah, so we are a drug company, right? We are in the development and hopefully soon the commercialization of pharmaceutical products. Specifically, we are developing a product for what is the largest aesthetics market in the world, right? Hair loss. And this product is the first non-hormonal, meaning it doesn't impact testosterone, oral, meaning you don't have to put it on your scalp, therapeutic for the condition. And that we are in the last stage of clinical development, which are phase 3 trials. And in these trials, we will evaluate the safety and efficacy of the product in about 1,500 men and women with hair loss.
Okay. Is there a certain customer that you're targeting, a specific person with a type of condition?
So in these clinical studies, there are extensive inclusion and exclusion criteria. The specific indication here is called mild to moderate androgenetic alopecia pattern hair loss. So what does that mean? So pattern hair loss is the most common form of hair loss. That is when you have frontal recession and vertex balding or balding on the crown in men, and then diffuse thinning and widening of the part in women. And it will affect 50% of all people, not just 50% of men, but 50% of all people in their lifetime. And there has not been an approval for this condition for an oral product since 1997, so I was in preschool, and there has not been an approval for an oral product in women ever. And so we're seeking the first ever female approval and then the first non-hormonal oral approval in men.
Do you see, like through this clinical trial, are you seeing a timeline for the best chance of recovery from hair loss, a certain age or a certain deterioration?
So it's really interesting that you ask that, and that in the clinical trial we can include people that have 3 different severities. 3V being the mildest trial eligible severity, where they have a small amount of vertex balding or balding on the crown. 5 being they have extensive balding, but they still have connectivity up front. And our presupposition going into this was that individuals on the milder end would do much better. As that is what's been shown with previous trials of pharmaceutical products. And it turns out we've seen very good response across all 3 in our phase 2 program. Now, importantly, the question I think everyone asks is, who isn't a good candidate, for the product? Who is not going to respond? And we actually think there's a fairly straightforward answer there, which is that androgenetic alopecia over time, the way it works is it takes your thick scalp hairs and it miniaturizes them, right? They thin out, and then eventually they will go away entirely, and it's replaced with a scarring process. So if you look at someone and they've got a shiny head where there's no hair whatsoever, those individuals no longer have hair follicles on their scalp. Those individuals will not respond to any medical therapy and would require something like hair transplantation to regain their hair.
That's interesting. So I'm curious to know more about just the journey and getting to where you are now. Obviously, you have a medical background, so you have experience in this area, but for any of our listeners, like, just wanting to understand how you got to this point here today.
So I think the journey of Veradermics is like the journey of really any startup, which is that, right, we were end users in an area, right? My co-founder and I are both board certified dermatologists. And in daily practice, we identified, right, these problems weren't
Hmm.
solving, things that, were a persistent scourge. And the comment I always make, for example, with hair loss is if you go ask a dermatologist, like, what do you really think about treating hair loss? They're like, oh, I wish I didn't have to see that in my practice. And it's not that they don't think it's a significant condition or bothersome to people. It's that the treatment options are so poor that the visits are not enjoyable because you can't get people the types of outcomes they want at present. And so we really are trying to change the bar as to what outcomes look like. And ultimately, that's where Veradermics came from, was the idea that there are these problems we see and that we understand and that we think we have a unique vantage point to solve.
So, how will your customers engage with using the drugs that you are actually able to bring to market? Would they go to their dermatologist? Would they then be prescribed? How would that work?
So everything that is currently, in investigational development is to become a prescription drug if approved. And so what that means is, as you suggest, someone would need a prescription, from a prescriber that would be filled at some form of pharmacy.
Okay.
Or these are not over-the-counter type products.
Right, right. And how do you have any evidence on the length of time someone would need to be on this treatment before they start to see results, or is that still too early?
So in phase 2 development, I think the only data that we've made public related to that is that as early as 2 months of treatment, we have seen cosmetically acceptable regrowth, which is very, very
That's
rapid.
exciting. Yeah.
If you look at, other products that have been approved, it's about 6 months to see statistically significant benefit and about a year to see real benefit. And to contextualize that, I, talk to dermatologists almost every day as part of my job. And last week I was speaking to someone who'd been a president of the American Academy of Dermatology, president of the American Board of Dermatology. And I asked him, as I ask basically every doc, how do you counsel your patient about expectations related to time to improvement and about the type of improvement that they may experience? And he had a really clear answer, which was, from a type of improvement they may experience, I tell everyone our goal is to stabilize your hair, right? We don't want you losing more. If we get any additional hair, that's a bonus, right? To me, that's unacceptable, right? The reason people treat their hair loss is because they want to get their hair back. The second comment was on time to improvement. And he says, I tell everyone, don't call me, don't come back for 6 months, because nothing works that quickly. And realistically, it's going to take us a year to know if this product works for you. In our case, we don't believe that to be true at all. As mentioned, we believe as early as 2 months, we're seeing cosmetically acceptable benefit in individuals who have been in our clinical studies. Obviously, early data from investigational studies, but certainly encouraging.
Yeah. And as we know, bringing any type of product to market, there's a pretty substantial runway. Now, doing something in biotech, a drug, can you talk through that process and from ideation through where you are now, phase 3 clinical trials, and then what's next to come for Veradermics?
Yeah, so the pharmaceutical industry is rightfully heavily regulated. Right, everything that we do is overseen by the FDA, and we follow very stringent regulations that are required to get a new drug approved. And so ultimately, in the stages of development, right, there are many things that you do, whether those be formulation of a product, whether those be preclinical work to characterize the performance of that product, or whether that be, robust clinical work. I think one of the things that I find most interesting in the pharmaceutical business that many people do not know is that actually one of the largest risk areas outside of clinical development, which is the obvious, like, does the science work, is the manufacturing of pharmaceutical products. And that, one thing the FDA wants us to guarantee to people, appropriately so, is that every single batch of drug we release is essentially identical. And so there is a whole discipline called chemistry, manufacturing, and controls by which we ensure that we have tested the product appropriately to know what's in it, and that each of our batches has, significant rigor supporting that you're getting the same drug in lot A that you were in lot C.
And all of this takes a lot of money.
It does take a lot of money.
And you've
It takes
done a lot of
time.
fundraising.
That we have.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about the process of raising funds for Veradermics?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that fundraising in any industry is relatively similar, although the amount of capital required is different, right? And I think when we talk about fundraising, at least in this case, what we're talking about is equity financing, right? Is we're a company that doesn't generate revenue, we don't take debt. And so from an equity financing perspective, I try to think about it, right, pretty straightforward, which is what is someone's alternative if they don't invest in the company? And I think that, if anyone has ever invested their own money in the stock market, they're probably well aware that if you invest in a broad index fund, right, which is essentially exposure to the US economy, your money will double every 7 years or so. Now, that is essentially a risk-free proposition to double your money every 7 years, which means our business, which is ultra risk-laden, right, where I think 9 out of 10 startups that get funded ultimately will fail, has to do much better than that to win. And so ultimately, as we think about fundraising, we think about the milestones or the events in time that generate and accrue real value to investors. And, how do we determine that in our industry? Because it's very different industry to industry. In our industry, it's all based on regulatory de-risk and clinical de-risk, right? And there is great historical data to say, as you make it to this stage in development, your probability of an approval is X. As you make it to the next stage in development, your probability of approval is Y. And so that decreasing risk as well as decreasing time to, cash flow ultimately drives the value of the business. And so everything we do is based on milestone achievement. And again, I think that's true regardless of the industry you're in. If you're in the swimsuit industry like Haley Seeger, right? Your job is to generate revenue and sell as many swimsuits as possible. In our industry, it's to generate clinical data as quickly as possible.
And so you hit these milestones, you kind of de-risk as you go, but as you continue to ask for more money, as you raise additional series, you're actually asking for much more cash because it takes much more money to get from one point to the next the further you get down.
Yeah, so each stage is, increasingly more capital intense, and certainly the only way to get someone excited to put up that money is execution. And I think, one of the things that I always say is like raising money is not cool. What you do with that money is what is cool. And one of the things I'm most proud of at Veradermics is that everything we have ever told our shareholders that we would do, we have gone out and done. And that doesn't mean that they're going to return their capital. That doesn't mean that anyone's going to make money, but it does mean, that we kept our promise to our shareholders, which is very important to me. And I think that, ultimately, in my mind, the question is always, what is the real milestone in the business? Like, what is our next fundable event? And right, that's usually a discrete number of items. That's not a laundry list of 10, 15. It's like one or two things. And then how do we make that occur as quickly as feasible? And to give a little more context there, right now, right, we're trying to bring in phase 3 data. Phase 3 data objectively, if favorable, is a massive de-risk for the business. It makes it more probable than not that a drug will become approved. And so the only thing from a time perspective that we can do to modify, the timeline to receive phase 3 data is to speed up enrollment of trial subjects, right? That's the only time modifiable. Once the subjects in the study, I can't make 6 months of trial participation go any faster, right, but we can get people in the study quicker. So we have an entire functional unit that is dedicated just to accelerating our key milestone.
Okay. And you're looking for people for your clinical trials now?
Yeah. So we need to enroll 1,500 people across 3 phase 3 studies and are actively enrolling currently. As of the time of this video, we're around halfway enrolled in our first phase 3 study. By the time this gets out there, we will be much farther along. And it is really remarkable to see the scale of what we're doing and the early clinical development. Right, you're talking about a dozen patients. Mainly who are healthy volunteers, mainly who are selected by a phase 1 unit, which is like a hospital essentially. In this, we're marketing in a way the trial to the public. We're making awareness of the trial to the public to recruit subjects to come join a clinical study to hopefully herald, the first breakthrough treatment in this space in essentially 30 years.
Yeah. One of the things I've really appreciated about you, so you've come through our summer accelerator back in 2020, and ever since then, we've kind of enrolled you back in as a mentor, as an instructor, and every year you teach the teams about fundraising. And I think that's something you've done really well, is going out and talking about what it is you're building and creating that value and explaining the process. And I think also investor relations and, maintaining that relationship over time. Regardless of the industry in which those that are listening are in, can you talk a little bit about like demystifying the fundraising process and maybe giving some advice or a pointers, some tips that you have?
Yeah, and I think that fundraising is actually really straightforward if you are doing what you are supposed to be doing. That ultimately all capital raising is based on achieving milestones. And in any given industry, as mentioned, there are specific milestones that are valuable, and that's all you need to do. So I think the simplest industries to think about are those in which revenue generation is the milestone, or like in tech, where you're talking about how many paying users do you have. And so ultimately, you can look to determine what is the value of my business, what is the next milestone at which I can raise at comparables, what do companies in your field do to be able to raise capital again, from an institutional investor. And usually there's a fairly clear point in time at which that occurs. And so ultimately, I think as you're building the ask, right, the question is always, how much money do you need to get to that next, de-risk? And you need to get that money. You then need to do everything feasible to get to that next milestone as quickly as possible. And that is ultimately, fundraising in a nutshell. And I think, right, there's so many distractions out there. There's so many things you can do with your time. It is usually one or two things in a business that will determine whether or not your business succeeds. And if you are not moving forward on those, then you're not really moving forward. And the final comment I'll make there is, I ask any entrepreneur the same three questions if I'm determining, whether or not I want to, help them out, or whether or not maybe you will invest. And those questions are very straightforward. What did you do last quarter? What are you doing next quarter? What are you doing this year? If someone cannot answer those questions, they should not be raising capital. They do not have a business. They have a hobby.
Yeah. Can you speak upon maybe how entrepreneurs would select investors, or even just the process of, you're not just asking them for money, you're bringing someone into your business, you're essentially selling off a piece of this thing that you've created. What do they need to consider?
Yeah, so anytime you take someone's money, you are taking on huge responsibility in that they are believing in you as the person who raised the money to execute for them. They're not believing in the company. And I think that is really important for people to understand, that you're taking personal responsibility on someone else's, financial well-being as they took a risk with you. And so, importantly, these are longitudinal relationships, right? Everyone thinks that, oh, we're going to hit this milestone and sell really quickly. Realistically, I think that the stats would suggest that when you start a business, if it's successful, on average, you're in that business for a decade, right? This is a huge, huge commitment of your life. And so those investors hopefully will be with you for that time. And, depending on the industry, there is a very big difference between money and money that is value accretive to the business. And a good example there is, in an industry like biotech where there's great capital intensity, oftentimes there is a need at some point, or at least a consideration at some point, for a company to enter the public markets as capital needs increase, not as an exit opportunity, but because the public markets provide the greatest access to capital, right? It's where the most liquidity exists. And so in order to access the public markets, you need the types of investors who can support you on the public markets, namely financial institutions that invest both privately and publicly. And so that type of investor selection is really critical as you move forward, and as it becomes about more than just taking money. It's about a capital formation strategy for the future.
Mm. That's great. And for those of us that have been following along, or have been watching your journey, it looks like it's been really smooth sailing. Can you tell? And you laugh, right? Can you tell us maybe a challenge that you faced, and maybe more than one challenge, and how you're kind of working to overcome?
So it's very funny. My dearest mentor, he describes it as hand-to-hand combat, right? The daily, there's hand-to-hand combat, which no one sees, right? And that there are daily challenges in any business. And, ultimately, I guess, to take a step back, right, it raises the question, like, what is my job as CEO, or what is the job of a CEO? And it's really threefold, right? One is the obvious, go raise money. Two is that because I get exposure to the outside world, whether that's investors and their needs, other stakeholders like, physicians or patients, that my job is to interpret that external world internally to drive corporate strategy. But then finally is where you're going, which is it's to put out little fires and ultimately as the CEO, you get brought every little fire in the business, no matter how big or small it is, it usually feels very big to the individual bringing it to you. And so any idea that every day is a day full of successes is absolutely not true. But if you have a good strategy and you execute it over the long term, you will see things that you talked about, in a kind of fantasy land come to reality. And that makes 100% of like the day-to-day ridiculousness not matter at all. And I will say matter-of-factly that there is literally nothing I enjoy more than going to work. And I have so much fun with what we're doing, even with the crazy stuff. Like you just have to love the battle.
Yeah. Any personal challenges and, navigating from being a doctor to an entrepreneur?
So it is just different. So, right, as a doctor, when I did my intern year, you work 80 hours a week and you're in the hospital and that exists. And you certainly learn to work really hard. And I credit having been, a practicing physician as being one of the things that gave me some of the maturity, even at a relatively younger age, to do what we're doing. The types of challenges you face in this business are much different. And I think the level of responsibility that you incur, and I think, again, that's something I want to get across to every young entrepreneur, is when you take other people's money, there is significant responsibility associated with that. And that, that responsibility when things are going great, it feels great. When things aren't necessarily going great, right, you tell them both ways. And ultimately, you can feel that people are counting on you. And I think that that's probably the hardest part of the business.
Yeah. And more responsibility as you start to bring in people that rely on you for a paycheck and you start to build relationships. It's not just you and your co-founders anymore.
So absolutely. And I think that is, one of the craziest things, right? We've scaled our workforce like 60%
That's
in
great.
Q1 this year. And that doesn't include the many other consultants, contractors, other people who financially benefit from the business. And I mean, it is remarkable to know, like people's livelihood is dependent on our success, and that there is an opportunity cost for our employees. They're all extremely talented individuals who could work anywhere, and right, they're choosing to work at Veradermics, and we need to live up to our promises for them as well.
So I've asked you a lot of questions, and I'm about to ask you 3 fun ones. So we'll see that in a second. But is there a question that you wished I asked you?
I think that the only topic I would hit on that I think you'd ask is any advice to kind of a young entrepreneur. And I guess the one thing I would say to people is that, right, this is not a job you're going to do alone. And that ultimately we have been very fortunate at Veradermics to have great mentors who have helped us along each stage. With that in mind, one thing that I think is really important is that someone can be an ultra expert in one area and a great mentor in that area, but not helpful in another. And I think a good example is like everyone likes to give commentary on fundraising. Not everyone has raised money before. Everyone likes to give commentary on clinical development. Maybe they're not an expert in that. And so you really have to have the right mentor at the right stage. And you have to ask yourself as you're getting feedback, like, does this person, one, have the appropriate amount of information to be giving me that feedback, right? Because you as the CEO always have an information advantage. And then 2, does that person have the appropriate skill set to be giving this? And, we've been really lucky to have people like Vlad Korich who are just like otherworldly talented individuals mentor us, where like he just knows everything, and that has been tremendous, and had people who have niche subject matter expertise as well. And you have to recruit these people to help you in your business.
Yeah. I love that piece of feedback because we often say to our entrepreneurs to delineate out who is it that's giving you the advice, and is this someone's opinion or is this actually rooted in their background, their experience? And it's really hard when you're early on to distinguish those 2 different things.
Oh, I 100% agree. And I think that to me, if I were, going back in time or telling like a young entrepreneur what to do, it ultimately goes back to this theme we've harped on a couple of times, which is to identify what are like the 1 or 2 things that matter in this business. And then what is it we can do to accelerate those things? And, importantly, and I think that this is not something like I came up with, this is like a common entrepreneurship thing, in the early days, as you're thinking about these milestones, whether it's generating revenue or whatnot, you do not have to do things that scale. You do not have to do things that will ultimately be the way your business thrives. You have to hit the milestone. And so, if that involves putting your product in the car, going to stores, doing these things that, like, yes, it's true, you can't 10x that behavior. You should still do it because you need to achieve the milestone, and you need to do everything that is in your capability to achieve the milestone, because that is the only way in which you're judged. And I guess, the only other kind of question or thing, like, what do I see go wrong frequently? I think, for example, in CCEI, we spend a lot of time talking about describing the problem and solution. And we talk about that narrative around a product. As important as the narrative around your product is the narrative around your business and how it will make investors money. And I often see that people have a great idea, and great ideas are abundant, but they can't tell the story of how they will execute on that idea in a way that returns capital. And ultimately, for a sophisticated investor to get excited about giving you money, they have to believe that the story as to how they're going to make money is as compelling as the story about your product, and that the story about how you will execute on that is as compelling as well.
If someone's not raising funds, how do you change that advice up?
So you mean they're in a business that doesn't require external capital? So I think it still comes to the same idea, which is, in those businesses, there's still a small number of things that matter, and you need to drive to those things, and you need to have a business plan that you have conviction around, right? You need to know, you may not know the entire way that you get from point A to point B, but you need to know what point B is.
Right.
And I think that a good leader will make it abundantly clear to everyone they work with what the key goals of the year are, and will constantly judge, whether they're achieving them. And a good example is, if you have a business that is a revenue generating business on which you get judged by revenue, which I think is the majority of businesses, and your corporate presentation does not have your revenue, does not have your quarter over quarter sales growth, and does not have commentary on what you are doing to drive quarter over quarter growth, then you are not thinking about your business correctly.
Yeah, no, that's really, really great feedback. I think the positioning for a long-term goal, thinking about what actually it takes to get to that point. A lot of entrepreneurs spend their time, I don't want to say busy work, but they're trying to do the little things that don't actually meet those milestones that are going to get to that ultimate goal.
And it's so easy to do that. I mean, so I'm a great offender here as well, right? Like, let's not like dilute ourselves there. And I think the classic example, and the employees gave me a really hard time, is like, very busy business, and we're moving into new office space, and I'm like messing around looking at office furniture, and they're like, no, you can't be doing that. And I'm like, but I like it. And they're like, doesn't matter.
Yep, exactly. Are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
Let's do it.
Okay, so these are intended to be fun, just right off the cuff, whatever you're thinking. So
you're telling me this whole thing hasn't been fun?
It's been a blast, Reid. It's been a blast. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
So hands down, the best piece of advice I've ever received is that conventional wisdom yields conventional results, right? It is always easy to default to the conservative answer, and it always sounds the most reasonable. Your job is not to be conservative in entrepreneurship. Your job is to take the appropriate risk. And the people who I've seen be ultra successful, right, who I aspire to be like, are people who have a differentiated understanding of risk and exploit that.
That's great. What's a book, TV show, or movie that offers valuable insights or inspiration for entrepreneurs? So one that's inspired you.
Oh, I mean, I think the best entrepreneurship movie is a classic. It's The Social Network. And I just saw this morning that Mark Zuckerberg, like real Mark Zuckerberg, bought a shirt out of that movie as well. Like, even he gets that it's just it's spot on. It's spot on making hard choices, and like, that ultimately, right, that it's business and it's tough.
Okay. What brings you joy?
Winning.
All right. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Reid. It was great to have you with us, and we wish you all the best on your journey and continuously watch your successes and hope that you'll continue to come back and join us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am so pleased to be here. And I guess kind of my final message is if you are, a UConn student and you don't have anything to do this summer, please reach out to us as we are actively looking for summer interns to help us with clinical trial recruitment. It will be a great learning experience. It will be great fun, and you will be helping potentially, herald the first approval in androgenetic alopecia pattern hair loss for an oral therapeutic in 30 years. Thank you all.
Awesome. You heard it here. So definitely take Reid up on his offer to join either a clinical trial or potentially an internship with Veradermics. Thank you again, Reid.
Of course, thank you.